Hey everybody, welcome to week 2. We're covering our founding fathers, a specific handful of them, and the formation of early American governance alongside the formation of the first divide in American discussions, although it is not the creation of the two-party system, which we will cover in detail next week. And then we will pivot away from early American history. So this is the first section of this course, Early America, and let's get going. So I'm not going to do this every week, but I think it's beneficial to give you guys a slide here and there on what we learned last week. Now, remember, this slide basically is in the end of last week's lecture. So if you want to get an overview of what is expected from you, make sure you look at the end of every lecture, specifically the what do we learn slide. So here are a couple of the answers to the key questions that I hope you are able to answer. I thought this would be just a simpler way of doing this instead of giving you the questions and making you go back through. Although again, I'm not going to do this every week, and this is a cherry on top for the lecture today, but not an expectation in the future. All right, so what are we doing today? We're going to dive into the contributions of some of our specific founding fathers. One thing that we're going to do is make a clear distinction between the contrasting contributions of revolutionary Samuel Adams and good old judicial John Adams, and dive into some other founding fathers. But it is very important to make sure we have this distinction. I remember when I was a TA at the University of Montana, there was a question on the final exam tasking them to identify the distinctive differences between these two individuals. Although they're second cousins, they have quite different contributions to early American governance, and it was surprising how many people got them mixed up. So I make sure that we have that understanding in this course. We're also going to look at the system of governance we have within our legislative body in the United States, bicameralism, its origins from the Constitutional Convention of 1787, some of the specifics of what happened at that convention, because without it, we would not have the United States Constitution as we know of it today. We're going to look at some of those concepts. I kind of pointed it out twice, bicameralism. And then we're going to look into a concept pluralism, and then some amendments that were included in our original Bill of Rights, which you saw from last week's readings, was when we look at the version that was passed by the House of Representatives, 17 original amendments that, of course, we know was condensed down to just 10. So let's get going and learn all this stuff. Right, so there's a shoulder cat. I'm just going to pretend it's not happening. So last week we left off with the moment in time where we realized the Shays Rebellion had revealed immense weaknesses within our federal government, within the national government at the time, the Articles of Confederation. So this revealed the dire need to revise the Articles and created the need for the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And that is where we see James Madison bringing up the first proposal to not just amend the articles, not just strengthen what we know as kind of a treaty uniting our 13 states, but instead create a new system of government altogether. We are going to propose the Virginia Plan, where we have the foundations of the U.S. Constitution. So James Madison comes with the Articles of Confederation, the Constitutional Convention of 1787 with this plan and with the support of essential key figures at the time, like George Washington, one of the individuals stepping out of his private life, which he resided in during the Articles of Confederation, as he lived out in Mount Vernon, finally stepping back into the limelight and contributing to this formation of a new governance by supporting the proposal brought forward by James Madison. So we do also want to understand this is an overarching slide about some of the details we'll be covering in the next few slides, but from 1787 to 1788 there was a period of stark conflict. We had the Federalists advocating for the revised Constitution, for the new formation of government, and the Anti-Federalists advocating for the maintenance of the old status quo. A lot of these sentiments are represented well within Samuel Adams, the Anti-Federalist sentiments, as he wanted to preserve the Articles of Confederation and not make stark revolutionary changes, as we just did about a decade prior. So one thing misconception we have to address right off the bat is we did not all want the United States Constitution as we know of it today. The majority, well, there was a pretty much 50-50 split among the general population and among those delegates representing the general population regarding whether we should maintain a confederal system of governance or a federal system of governance. Of course, history tells us that the federal system won out, and it was the interests of the Federalists who finally had the last say in this debate, as they were the pro-constitutionalists and won the ratification of the Constitution in 1789. So we see that this is where, and I had a mistake in the slide that I'll have to fix, but we see the U.S. Constitution has been ratified. We'll see the Bill of Rights ratified just a few years later in 1791 to appease the interests of many anti-federalists at the time. Those interests which are represented in the Anti-Federalist Papers. So let's start with a brief discussion about Samuel Adams, or as I like to put it, revolutionary Samuel Adams. Just a little rule of thumb to help you remember his contributions in contrast to his second cousin John Adams. So, who is Samuel Adams? He's known broadly by historians as the father of the Revolution. We'll see there's an optional video posted on Eagle Online where it's like a 3-minute background video on his personal experiences. He was, as a younger individual, known for being a not great tax collector, but that was quite traditional at the time, as tax collectors were struggling to maintain their activities and truly adequately collect taxes. He acted as the lieutenant governor and governor for the state of Massachusetts until John Hancock later ousted him from the role shortly after John Adams, which is his second cousin, and James Baldwin wrote the state's constitution. Just a neat little bit of history. And among his peers, he was known as a great propagandist in many eyes. Great for being a phenomenal author and being able to convey the interests of the revolution to the general public and to other statesmen. So one of the most notable things we remember from high school history classes is how he contributed to the mobilization of Americans to throw tea into the Boston Harbor as they dressed as native individuals and dumped the tea into the harbor. Although historians do argue that he most likely did not contribute to the actual act, but he was a significant person in the planning of it and mobilizing of this activity. So led individuals to contribute to the Boston Tea Party, dumping tea into the Boston Harbor, and later aligned with the Anti-Federalist Collective, wanting to preserve the Articles of Confederation, pushing against the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So we can look at Samuel Adams as a unique individual, as without his contributions, we might not have had the success and persistence of the American Revolution, while also we see him pushing against the system of government we have today, the U.S. Constitution, something that we tend to not maintain as a connection in our memories from our high school history classes. So how does Samuel Adams, revolutionary Samuel Adams, contrast to his second cousin, John Adams, who had later and more significant contributions to the federal system of government in the United States? Well, John Adams was known for his temperance. One of the most notable things in his early career when he was acting as a lawyer, he represented the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. We all remember from high school history, shots fired into the collective of protesters for throwing rocks. Multiple people died, revealing this overarching, some would say federal presence, but overarching British presence within our domestic lands. So we had individuals lose their lives. And at the time, this is where you see in France, the kings beheaded in the streets, individuals hung for their actions, hung for treason and other horrible activities. And John Adams said, we need to establish a precedent with this example. We need to give them true due process. And John Adams represented this with his own actions as he represented the British soldiers in court after the Boston Massacre, getting many of them actually acquitted for the crimes as he found a lack of guilt among their individual hands. So, showing prudence and restraint in the judicial system and the need for due process for all individuals regardless of their citizenship early on in American history, as the British soldiers were not U.S. citizens, and he adamantly defended their right to have a fair trial in the court system. He was later known to become the second president of the United States after being the vice president under old Georgie, of course, George Washington. He is known quite well for aligning with the Federalist views and representing the Federalist Party when they had their peak period in governance, also leading to a bit of their demise as he was one of the last Federalist representatives within the national government and implemented some policies that were highly negatively viewed upon by the general public, like the Alien and Sedition Act, which resulted in him being the second president of the United States, but also the first one-term president in the United States history. But also we want to give him a lot of credit here. Without his advocacy for the representation of the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, we may not have as many of the implementations of fair court procedures within the Bill of Rights. So a lot of those due process protections that we have, like a right to a speedy trial, a right to be protected from double jeopardy, your right to not have to infringe upon yourself. So all of these and many more judicial protections stem from the actions of John Adams in the early days of American history. So now that we covered how those two starkly different individuals contributed to American history, and it's worth noting they were family, they were cordial with each other, and only in very select times had they ever starkly disagreed, and they had notable difference in age. So let's talk briefly about one of the most notable moments in U.S. history, the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So at this meeting, we had our founding fathers meet to address the faults that were revealed at Shays' Rebellion. We need to revise the Articles of Confederation. We need to slightly strengthen the national government and make it so they can respond to the needs, both militarily and legislatively, to the citizens and the states, most importantly, the states of these United States. Now, what happened at this Constitutional Convention is James Madison came in and really put a wrench in things as he proposed the Virginia Plan, bringing forward an idea that we are going to completely abandon the Articles of Confederation. The Articles do not matter on any level. We are revising this system of government. I know 8 years ago we ratified a system of government after the Revolution, but that was a failed attempt, and now we are going to implement our true system of governance to push back against the issues of the time. So we see this proposal come forward, but as we often overlook through history, many were against it. The majority at the first proposal were against the Virginia Plan, and it took months of debate and critiquing and amending of these plans to eventually result in having the Constitution. And these plans did not just happen in one specific room among delegates and our founding fathers, the names that we know so well through high school history, but in numerous states, at numerous meetings in different states and over multiple months, and also through publications in the public press, as individuals like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison were all writing to convince the general public that we need to draft a constitution and ratify the Constitution as is, while the Anti-Federalists were writing simultaneously advocating against this new system of government, arguing that it would be far too strong and concentrate all of our powers and diminish the sovereignty of our states. So what happened at this convention? A lot of debate, multiple proposals, which we'll cover in detail on the next slide, but there were two main things. And I always view this as the great and not so great compromise. The Great Compromise, known as is the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, is what implemented bicameralism in the United States. The Great Compromise established bicameralism in the United States. It said, we will divide our legislature into two bodies, one that is equally represented to appease the interests of the small states like New Jersey, and one that is proportionally represented to appease the interests of the large states like Virginia at the time. Go Virginia. And then, of course, when you're dealing with population representation based off population, you need to address one key issue that was front and center at the time. Who are we counting in this population? Especially at a time where there was a lack of understanding about the human rights of some individuals that were falsely framed as property due to the issue of slavery in the South. So the 3/5 Compromise addressed that, found a middle ground for the needs of the North and the interests of the Southern slaveholders, as 3/5 of the enslaved population will count towards the general population for those southern states, resulting in the South being moderately represented within the general population regarding their general population, although not entirely, and the North having their needs met as they were normally smaller states with fewer populations, but with all freed populations. So it was an issue at the time regarding how we count representation, and some arguing about the morality and lack of morality in the slave economics of the South at the time. So let's go into detail about what happened at this convention. There were two main proposals, but let's start with this Virginia plan to the left. It's flipped, so I got to do things backwards. Weird. So the Virginia plan, it was proposed just a few days into the convention. It was written by James Madison, and this plan called for two bodies within the legislature. We're going to divide the legislative body, the most powerful body in government, into two bodies so we don't have too much of a concentration into the hands of just a few select individuals. We will have representation based on population in each of these states. James Madison, coming from Virginia at the time, the largest state by population, no matter how you count it. And we see that, of course, they want representation based on population because they want the most power in the system of government. And he advocated for both legislative bodies to be based off of population. Fascinating concept. He additionally proposed the concept of checks and balances and the three branches of government. Some historians argue that this actually stemmed from a work by Montesquieu, in which he advocated for the checks and the separation of powers within government, and his idea of that stemmed from a misreading of a text as he was trying to translate it from a different language, and it was actually about, the original text was about the concept of separating church and state, and he misinterpreted it as a concept between separating power between the three branches, which was the birth of a brand new great idea about structural governance, which persisted in the Virginia plan and, of course, our United States Constitution later. So Virginia plan comes up. Most of the delegates at this convention are stunned. They're shocked. They are thinking, we are here to revise the articles, not create a new system altogether. This is delaying the progress that we could make at this convention. But Madison was wise, and he gathered the support of many actors, like one of the most notable actors at the time representing legitimacy in George Washington, the silent delegate of the convention. And the head of the convention. So we see at the time this Virginia plan being proposed. Now, it was not met with immediate support. There was another plan proposed just a few days after called the Pinckney Plan. Some historians debate exactly the logistics of it because there's no exact draft of this plan from the convention. And the only draft we have is one that was published by Pinckney years later after the convention, in which he argued that he proposed much of the ideas of the Constitution. Fascinating. Shows that even at our constitutional conventions, we do not have perfect paperwork, and much of what we know about the Constitutional Convention actually stems from the notes taken by James Madison. So we thank him for his detailed note-taking at the convention, and some historians would also argue Pinckney, maybe you're not as notable as you may have claimed in your later text. So what happened? The Virginia plan later amended with small details from the Pinckney plan as they picked and chose. Although the Pinckney plan highly resembled the Virginia plan, we can let that fade out in our general knowledge of history. But a few weeks go by, a few months go by, and then we see an opposition plan stem up. Because remember, this is a conflict that was arising at the time. Who will be in charge? Small states or large states? Because we realized that the absolute sovereignty of every single state equally was not working in this confederal system. So we're going to strengthen the national government, and who's going to have their hands on power? The small states or the large states? Well, Virginia wanted to propose a plan benefiting the large states, and New Jersey said, wait, let me represent the needs of the smaller states. Of course, New Jersey, small state over there, one of the small states in the Union at the time. So the New Jersey plan arises, written by William Patterson. If you went to college out east, you would know that name, but you're in college in Montana, so you probably don't that well. So continuing on, this plan had a proposal. We will not be dividing our legislative body. We will have a single governing body, and this body will represent every single state equally. We will have a representative or two from each state, and they will all govern this single legislative body unanimously. Very similar of a structure to the Articles of Confederation, as we had the unilegislature at the time governing the entirety of governance, although he did have acknowledgement of three branches of government in this plan, and also proposed another dimension that was later adopted in the convention, which was a Supreme Court, a higher judiciary among all others connected to the national level responsible for interpretation. We'll see that will also require additional rulings to strengthen its powers, and specifically through judicial review through Marbury versus Madison, but that is for another discussion, particularly when we cover the judicial branch later on. And of course, they also proposed a federal agency to tax trade, something that would be forfeited during the convention, but we see that stemming up later on as we see enhanced economic mechanisms within our national government intended to strengthen the federal government, proposed at the time and advocated for heavily by our boy on Broadway, Alexander Hamilton. But Alexander Hamilton did a bit more than just later work within our federal government. And at this convention, like I said before, there were multiple plans. And Alexander Hamilton proposed one himself. But let's make sure we know very confidently. There were two dominating plans that represented the vast majority of the interests at the convention and the two different approaches we could have gotten. Those are the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. So make sure you remember the characteristics of these two plans and how it was a compromise between these two that resulted in the U.S. Constitution. But without having other proposals that shifted the Overton window, making these two proposals more appealing, we might not have had the compromises that we had at the convention. So let's look at one of the least appealing proposals made at the convention by our boy on Broadway, Alexander Hamilton, where he proposed what is known by history as the Hamilton Plan, where he said that the reasoning for proposal was that both plans, the Virginia and the New Jersey plan, put too much faith in what he referred to as the mob, what we would refer to as the people at the time, arguing that we need a stronger national government and a weaker focus on the individual liberties of each state and each person, as they are vulnerable to the will of the mob and vulnerable to majority rule without minority protection. So Alexander Hamilton comes up, he gives an emotional speech calling for the need for a state that responds, calling for the need for an executive that can act quickly in times of need and appeal to the interests of their population. But this speech came to a pretty annoying halt, one that resulted in nearly every single delegate booing him off of the convention floor, advocating for later proposals, but eventually shifting the Overton window, making the Virginia plan sound so much better. And it was one notable line at the end of this speech that really put the nail in the coffin, as Hamilton calls for this strong state, responsive state, powerful state, but then he says something along the lines of, we need a state in which we have a strong and empowered king. And that word was the nail in the coffin for any Hamilton plan, as he referred to the head of the executive as the king, and all of the delegates roared in opposition, saying we will not be implementing a system where we refer to anyone as a king. That is exactly what we have shed blood against, was the concept of monarchical governance, and we will not become another one. And Alexander Hamilton shifted that Overton window, making the Virginia plan and the power of the mob far more optimistic than the powers of any king in the United States. So Hamilton's plan laughed off. We do see he did win out some positive sentiments later on Broadway. We'll talk about him throughout the entire course. But that was not all. We see the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan persisting, colliding. We have the Federalist Papers advocating for a lot of the dimensions of the Virginia plan. We have the Anti-Federalist Papers being published in the newspapers of New York and Virginia, arguing for the interests of the New Jersey plan, and the Anti-Federalist sentiment saying we need small state collectives instead of this national, overarching, overly powerful, overly domineering governance that will not allow the liberty of our states or the liberty of our individual people. So what happens? Well, we thank the oldest individual at the convention, Benjamin Franklin, for helping lead a compromise, known at the time as the Connecticut Plan or the Connecticut Compromise, and known by history as the Great Compromise. Now, this plan merged a lot of these proposals. Okay, we will have a two-body legislature. We're going to appease the interests of the Virginia plan, but we must also appease some of the interests of the New Jersey. We're going to take one dimension of their plan, having a legislative body that is based on equal representation. We'll make that one of the bodies within our bicameral system, within our two-body legislature. And the other body, all right, Virginia plan, we'll let you win out. We'll have the other body's representation based on population. That compromise was the origins of the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate, as the House of Representatives has representation based on population, as they currently stand with 435 representatives, and the Senate with equal representation, 2 senators a state, now currently standing at 100 Senate representatives. So there was a compromise between the two plans. We also see that when we talked about having any form of representation based on population, there was an issue. As I mentioned before, slavery. And this is where the not so great compromise comes in, where we have the 3/5 compromise that was proposed to address the needs of both states, both proposals. Look, the southern states, if we include the enslaved population, although they do not have any power to influence the interests and needs of their states, if we include them in the population count per representation, we will have an unequal national government that overly represents the needs of the states that rely on the lives of people who they do not let influence governance. Now, of course, let's let it be acknowledged at the time, the northern states were doing the same thing. We counted women entirely for the population, yet did not give them rights to influence governance either through elected positions or through voting at the time. So this was an issue that was a bit more accepted at the time, allowing people to count towards population, although we do not grant them the right to vote. So we have an agreement made, the 3/5 compromise. The enslaved population will count 3/5 as a whole to the representation of the southern states, diminishing the value of each individual in those states and declaring them not citizens. We see there was a notable individual at this convention, especially stemming at the time, especially contributing more heavily during the time period of the Connecticut Compromise. This individual, Governor Morris from Pennsylvania. He's actually the delegate who spoke the most during the convention. And you may have seen a clip or a picture of some point, all doing so, standing upon one wooden leg. And he was seen, and at this convention he was quoted saying, and I quote, "Upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The houses in this city are worth more than all the wretched slaves which cover the rice swamps of South Carolina." End quote. Not only being the most outspoken representative at the Constitutional Convention, but representing clear moral lines, saying that if you want to include the enslaved population in the total count, you must give them rights and treat them not as property, but as citizens wholly. Governor Morris, somebody who will fade into the background of history, but we know him greatly for the notable oratory contributions he made at the Constitutional Convention. So we see the Virginia plan slightly built upon by the Pinckney plan, later in contrast to the New Jersey plan. Making both of them seem better was the Hamilton plan, as he talked about far too strong of a unitary, but definitely made the Virginia plan far more accessible, shifting that Overton window. And then, of course, eventually resulting in a great compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, in which we merge the plans and find ways to address some of the issues that are halting our ability to compromise and come together, maybe in some immoral avenues, but those immoral avenues will be revised at a later date, as we know through high school history. So we see that this convention resulted in about 4 months of debate about multiple plans proposed, notable shifts in general perspectives, and then this convention ends with the words of the oldest delegate there, Benjamin Franklin. Well, kind of, the written word of Benjamin Franklin. As he was 81 years old, he did task James Wilson, another delegate at the convention, for speaking on his behalf and presenting his written words. As he states, quote, I confess that I do not entirely approve this Constitution at present, but, sir, I am not sure I shall never approve it. For having lived long, I have experienced many instances of being obliged, by better information or fuller consideration, to change opinions even on important subjects, which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise. It is therefore that the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgments, and to pay more respect to the judgments of others. He goes on and finishes this speech saying, quote, I agree to this Constitution with all of its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us, and there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered. Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, because I am not sure that it is not the best. End quote. Acknowledging the faults of his own ideology, acknowledging that perfection is something that is far from achievable at this time. But what is best, sir, is what I propose to be the Constitution of the United States. Those insightful words capped a convention and started a new process, state by state ratification. And that state by state ratification resulted in the eventual ratification of the United States Constitution. So let's continue. We have the Constitution. Let's get a little recap of what we just learned. We had the Constitutional Convention of 1787. In this convention, we had the Virginia and the New Jersey plan standing in opposition to each other. And the resulting compromise that merged the two plans was the Great Compromise. What did it do? Primarily, it established bicameralism, which is the division of power within the legislative branch into two bodies: the House of Representatives appeasing the interest of Virginia, and the Senate appeasing the interest of New Jersey. And we also have a reality that we had to come to a compromise, known at sometimes as the federal ratio, and others, primarily what we remember, the 3/5 compromise, in which the representatives in the House will be determined by population, but we will address the issue of slavery by, quote, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons, end quote. We have a constitution protecting slavery in dimensions while creating the roadmap to revising this immoral institution. But that was not the only way we have to compromise. We will see another compromise will come a few years later with the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, we'll learn about this as we go on the next few weeks, but it's really a list of civil liberties, a list of protections for the states from this new national government. What does that mean? It is appeasing the interests and the needs of the Anti-Federalists, those who lost the argument at the convention, who ended up having their interest not be listened to as we ratified our Constitution in opposition to their interests. So, the Bill of Rights appeased the needs of the minority. Majority rule with minority protections. That's pluralism. And the Bill of Rights represents that well, a few years later, ratified in 1791. And we will look at that momentarily. So, the U.S. Constitution is in effect. States had their own constitutions prior, and this resulted in a lot of the inspirations to drafting what we have in our national constitution. We also see it was ratified over the span of numerous years on a state-by-state basis, with Delaware being the first to ratify in 1787, and then eventually Rhode Island being the last to ratify in 1790. We see, and they didn't even, apologies, I'll save that for another slide. So we see the gradual state-by-state ratification over the span of 3 years, and eventually the Bill of Rights, the compromise that was made to appease the interest of those later signers to the Constitution, was ratified in 1791, just a year after the last state ratified the overarching Constitution. And we remember The Great Compromise, established bicameralism. And what is bicameralism? It is the division of the legislature into two clear bodies, the House of Representatives and the Senate, when we look at bicameralism in the United States. Also, we remember that they established three branches of government, a Supreme Court, and a clear system of checks and balances between the three bodies. So, again, I'm going to be a bit repetitive on some slides, but it is important we have these clear takeaways. What is bicameralism? It is the division of power within the legislative branch into two distinct bodies. It created the House and it created the Senate. Two very distinct chambers within the legislative branch, which is the branch tasked with drafting legislation that guides our daily lives. Now, we will have division of powers within these two bodies, specifying how the House of Representatives, the body intended to represent the interests of the people, and the Senate, the body intended to be a check on the interests of the people, will govern. We also see this is represented and established through the Great Compromise. As we remember, the Great Compromise established bicameralism. Possible test question, and a bit repetitive information there, as we will have proportional representation and equal representation within the legislature due to the Great Compromise. So, one concept we're talking about at this time is pluralism. We did not just simply have a majority vote at our Constitutional Convention. We had constant assembly, constant debate, and constant acknowledgement that the majority, or what some would refer to as mob rule, is not absolute, and we must have majority rule with minority protections. And that is where the persistence of pluralism exists in the United States, as the United States is one of the prime examples of a pluralist system of governance. So let's be clear and provide a concrete definition. What is pluralism? Pluralism is a theory that views politics as a conflict amongst groups where there are multiple groups vying for power within a single system. Think of it simply as there are Democrats, there are Republicans, there are Greens, there are Libertarians, there are whatever RFK Jr. was in the last election. There are a wide range of political party identities. There are also a wide range of ideological identities. There's liberalism, conservatism, and so much more. And we can see this is represented in multiple other ways. Demographic groups, age, race, many other factors, gender, other dimensions of that. So we cannot just have whatever political party, whatever ideology, race, age, gender that dominates the majority have absolute control. No, we have to have a majority governance with minority protections. We have to acknowledge that within a single system, there is always multiple groups vying for power within a single system. And that single system cannot govern the interests of just the majority, but the majority with those minority protections. Political decision-making in this system is characterized by compromise and accommodation. We have a pluralist system of government because at the Constitutional Convention, we had a pluralist collective of delegates who both governed by majority, but also through accommodation of the interests of those smaller states like New Jersey via compromise at the Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise. So let's talk about that Bill of Rights again. So remember, we needed the Bill of Rights written to appease the interests of the Anti-Federalists at the time. Now, it's worth noting, James Madison, a Federalist at the time, was the author of these Bill of Rights. Of course, this is a large part due to him being a listener to those at the convention, addressing and understanding deeply the needs of the Anti-Federalists as they have advocated for them from convention, meeting to meeting, over and over again. Also, it is worth noting that this divide was not as stark as some may perceive. Nearly all delegates at the convention agreed on the general sentiment that state rights are beneficial to all, and we must have the unity of the 13 states and avoid secession, and with that means the strengthening of state autonomy and the sovereignty of these states. And the state autonomy and sovereignty is the whole reason why we rebelled against the British. So even those advocating for a strengthened national government still maintains general preferences for state autonomy and the nuances of governance that will be present in every single state. So James Madison, a Federalist at the time, wrote the document known as one of the most representative documents of the needs of the Anti-Federalists. So another example of accommodation and compromise. So James Madison proposed the Bill of Rights in 1789. It's worth noting, this was to be amended. This original Bill of Rights that he proposed in 1789 had 19 amendments to it. Now later, the document that I have posted on Eagle Online, which is one of our primary readings of the week, this was passed by the House of Representatives with 17 amendments within the guiding document, and eventually reduced to 12 amendments, which were passed by the Senate, and then only 10 amendments, which were ratified on the state-by-state basis. So we see multiple steps in this procedure. When we look at the amendments that were passed by our legislative branch, we would have a 12 amendment Bill of Rights, but of course that did not meet the state level critique, and we did have the 10 amendment Bill of Rights as we know today. Some of the amendments that were revised, axed, or merged with others include amendment regulating the number of citizens per representative, amendments focusing that Congress cannot increase their pay to representatives until after election, one that called that Congress shall not make a law establishing a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That, of course, got amended to be a part of the First Amendment, but it was originally the Third. The amendments I just listed were the original First, Second, and Third Amendments. So we see that what we know today as the First and Second Amendments were not that high up on the list in the original drafts, but eventually resulted in being so, as they were the ones that were accepted. So we see multiple other amendments, and it'd be I honestly think a little bit redundant to read them off to you, but it is in the week's reading, so make sure you view those and at least skim that reading this week. So, Bill of Rights was ratified, the 10 amendments after this tedious process, going through both bodies within the legislature and then going to the states for ratification. A process we will go into excruciating detail understanding in the end of this course around week 11, I believe. But we'll save it for that day. Until then, let's just make sure we have a general understanding of what the Bill of Rights even states. We remember that First Amendment, free speech and assembly. Second Amendment, right to bear arms in a well-regulated militia. Third Amendment, no housing and quartering of soldiers, basically stating they cannot force you to house soldiers in your home and feed them, as some were forced to do at the time. One that has been a bit outdated, but we do see its importance at that time quite notably. Fourth Amendment, no unreasonable search and seizure. You may have heard this, driving around town, if you get pulled over and you do not want a cop going through your car, well, they have to have a reasonable doubt to do so. So it is due to this amendment giving you that protection, so they can't just go through your car and go through your belongings if they desire. We thank the Fourth Amendment for that right. We also have the Fifth Amendment, no double jeopardy, and there's a lot that this amendment does. Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh are and the Eighth, far more nuanced than I make them out to be in this slide, as we will go into detail on them later on, but I just want to make sure we get a general understanding. Fifth Amendment protects you from double jeopardy. You cannot be tried for the same crime twice in a criminal court. Say they proved that you were not guilty, and then later evidence came, they cannot try you again, as they already brought you to court once. This protects people from being tried over and over and over again until the state wins a case, even if they did not have an adequate argument. This also protects one from being a witness against themselves. If I always reference it, and every semester, less and less people know it, but I grew up watching the Chappelle Show. And there's a bit in that show where he's testifying in front of Congress, and they're asking him questions that he does not want to answer because it would be self-incriminating. And what does he say? He says, I plead the Fifth. So you plead that Fifth. You don't have to incriminate yourself or say anything in times when you're being questioned by, say, Congress or any other committees. We've seen many elected officials being questioned through oversight committees and frequently using that classic line, I plead the Fifth. So we also know the Sixth Amendment, your right to speedy and public trial. You cannot be have charges brought against you and then sit in jail for 5 years as they wait to give you a right to a jury of peers. Seventh Amendment is that jury of peers. Eighth Amendment, no cruel and unusual punishment or excessive bail. This is a great one for representing the differences in interpreting our Constitution by either originalist or living constitutionalist, as you can either state that you can't have cruel and unusual punishment, but you could have cruel or unusual punishment because they chose to use the word and instead of the word or. And if punishment is cruel but not unusual, that technically is constitutional. Also, if it's unusual but not cruel, it's technically constitutional. Now, that would be a hardline originalist interpretation. A living constitutionalist would say, I mean, you can't be cruel or unusual. We know that either of those types of punishments would not be allowed in modern U.S. judicial systems. So it shows that difference. How strictly do you interpret the words our founding fathers used to write this Constitution? Are you critiquing every word for word and taking it exactly as it applies, or is there more nuance that allows you to have the Constitution be a living, breathing document that can address the needs of each generation as they come? We also see that Ninth Amendment. No amendment shall override the rights granted by the Constitution, kind of stating a roadmap for how future amendments cannot be too overriding of the rights granted in the foundations of our Constitution. This one's a bit complex and is played out more so in judicial interpretations, and we will not be focusing on that in this course. If you go the law route, you will probably be heavily experiencing some analysis of that Ninth Amendment. And the 10th Amendment, one that every now and then gets a lot of attention, but every now and then also falls to the wayside. It is that all power that is not delegated to the federal government in our Constitution or statutory law is granted to the states and the people. So it is basically stating if the upper governments, the central government, does not address something, the lower entity has the right to address it. And if that entity does not address it, it continues to trickle down, and anything that is not addressed by the federal government directly or the state governments is then left up to local governments, counties, and then the people, households. So it is your freedom to address the nuances of life in a system of government. So I very briefly want to discuss the 11th Amendment because I get the question every now and then, because I tend to jump right to the 12th and then almost cover every amendment from there on out. But this one does not get that much attention. The 11th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the first individual amendment ratified. It was ratified very quickly after the original Bill of Rights in 1795. Generally understood, it was a protection of states within the judicial system. It limited federal jurisdictions and protected states from being sued by citizens of different states or other nations. A citizen of without the state's consent. So a citizen of, say, France cannot sue the state of North Carolina for whatever reason, unless the state consented for that suit. So it's a specifics issue regarding the judicial system on within federalism, which is an issue for a later course. So what system of government did we create? I just told you a long story about the convention, the character traits of some of our founding fathers, and the later developments after that convention regarding the Bill of Rights, some of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist interests. Federalist and Anti-Federalist divide, I'll go into a lot of detail next week. But how do we understand the system we implemented afterwards? So what do we have in the United States? Well, we know we have a representative democracy in which we have citizens who have the right to vote for individuals who can gain suffrage and then represent the interests of the general population. Other words, you can refer to this as a constitutional republic. Because what is this? What is a republic? A republic is a system, a scheme of governance with representation. So that is interchangeable with representative democracy. You could say either word and they would mean the same thing. Representative democracy or republic, same word. And then a constitutional republic would be one in which that scheme of representation is guided by a legal constitution and single guiding constitutional document, which we of course know is the U.S. Constitution we have in the United States. That is how we have the Democratic Republic of the United States, or some refer to as the Constitutional Republic of the United States. And this all relies on that foundational theory of governance, pluralism. That in this system, in our constitutional republic, we have multiple groups vying for power, representing a pluralist system of governance at large, where we have majority rule and guaranteed minority protections. It is important to make sure you remember the character traits of our government through this slide. So, did we do this with unanimous support? As I've mentioned a couple times in this lecture, the answer is straight up no. There was little to no unanimous support. And if we had a system of government like the Articles of Confederation, we would have basically no legislation because we would not have that unanimous 13 state support. So what happened? What does this lack of unanimous support look like? It looks like a divide between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. These are not political parties. I will give you 3 clear reasons why they are not political parties at the end of this lecture, and next week I'll point out 3 reasons why the first political party system implemented in the United States is the first political party system. So let's talk about why this is not the first political party system. This divide simply stems from the debate around the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. There is one overarching issue between these two individuals. Do we want a strong national government or strong state governments? Which do you prefer? If you want a strong national government, you are a Federalist. If you want a strong state government, you're like Samuel Adams over there in the Anti-Federalist camp. This divide was not ideological. This divide was not institutional, but was ideological. It was about conceptualizing this new government, but it was not institutionalized as we did not have party structures implemented within our system of government. We will go in detail about how the political party system was institutionalized next week, but let's briefly talk about how divides can persist without it becoming an institutional divide. So we have the divide between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and this was represented mainly through newspapers published in the states of New York and Virginia by the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, known as the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. Thank you, historians, for making this pretty easy to remember. So, what did these papers and these collectives generally advocate for? Well, we remember that overarching conflict is how strong the central national government should be. The Federalists wanted a strong national government. Now, if we look at the demographics of the Federalists, they were generally urban. Think of concentrated in cities. They were generally representing the northern states, manufacturers over plantations. They supported the drafting of the Constitution because what did it do? It strengthened our national government. And they wanted eventually, although this was not a focus too heavily early on, they did want to eventually create a national military. Not necessarily a strong national military in today's eyes, but a national military that exists generally. Remember, the Articles of Confederation had no national military and relied on individual gun ownership and state militias. Now, who are some of the most notable Federalists? We know Benjamin Franklin, advocating for, know quite well through that quote from the end of the convention, advocating for the ratification. John Adams, a known Federalist. John Jay, one of the first Supreme Court Justice of the United States. We'll go into details on him later because it's some entertaining little aspects. Alexander Hamilton, our boy on Broadway, who secretly wanted a unitary government, although he'll just be advocating that interest in backroom deals as he's Secretary of State and holds other positions, and Secretary of the Treasury. And then James Madison, one of the primary authors alongside Hamilton and John Jay of the Federalist Papers. So we remember those three individuals, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, wrote the Federalist Papers under the pseudonym Publius. They pretended to be one person, and they were writing different perspectives under a collective pseudonym, so even readers knew that it wasn't one person, it was a collective of authors. So we see this highly organized collective of those three authors writing the Federalist Papers. Now, the Anti-Federalist Papers, well, they're far less organized. They're far less institutionally implemented. They are advocates for a weak central government and strong states. They are Southern. They're normally representing the larger states at the time, like Virginia and the Carolinas. They're highly rural, representing those southern states, and they're weary of the U.S. Constitution as it is a document strengthening our national government. They also advocated adamantly that any government on the national stage would just be used to override the rights of citizens and create conflict abroad. So they advocated for strong state militias and a heavy reliance on that Second Amendment, individual gun ownership and state militias. That will then help the national government in times of need, similarly to how the modern presidency uses the National Guard, oftentimes state National Guards mobilized under national interest. Now we also see the Anti-Federalists advocated for the Bill of Rights adamantly. They wanted this Bill of Rights because, we will go into this later on, but the Bill of Rights was a document restricting the national government, providing 10 protections for states. And we will see there is a process called selective incorporation later on, in which we will require on a case-by-case basis for the Supreme Court to tell us that the Bill of Rights not only applies to the federal government, but also states. So this document, simply put at this point, we want to remember it as a document presenting the safeties for states and their autonomy, representing the interests of the Anti-Federalists. Now, who are the Anti-Federalists? Some of the most notable ones, Thomas Jefferson from the South. He, of course, later helped create the Democratic Republicans. Some even refer to them as the Jeffersonian Republicans, shifting, institutionalizing the Anti-Federalist interests. We also see John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, George Mason, a lot of these individuals being some of the last to ratify and support the U.S. Constitution, although they did all generally support it eventually, although some were after its ratification. So, Federalist Papers, written under the pseudonym Publius. Why did they go by the name Publius? Well, Publius Valerius Publicola, a legendary Roman aristocrat and statesman, helped overthrow the last Roman king, Tarquin the Proud, and was instrumental in founding the Roman Republic in 509 BCE. Why am I talking about Rome? Because, well, these are some of the works a lot of our founding fathers were reading. This is what they were inspired by. Rome at the time prior to this was a monarchy, just like the US was under monarchical rule under Britain. And we see that Publius helped lead this revolt against this monarchical system of government alongside Brutus, who we will see is a key figure in the Anti-Federalist Papers. But why did they choose Publius to be the representative of their advocacy for the Constitution? Because Publius did something after he helped create this new system of government, helped overthrow the monarchy. And when there were concerns that he overthrew this monarchy just to get power in his own hands and concentrate power independently into the hands of Publius, Publius said, as a statesman, he proposed this new law. And this new law is that if anyone, any individual, were to try and take the power of the state for the interest of their own self-motivation, self-gain, they will be vulnerable to punishment by death. So Publius, leading this revolution against a monarchy, creates this new system of government, and his first act is to call and say that I am restricting my own ability to concentrate power into my own hands, because we revolted against a monarchy for this institutional purpose, not my internal individual purpose. So Publius represents the idea that, hey, we have just concentrated power, but we have done so to give it back to you, the people, and to protect you from an overpowering, tyrannical system of government. And that's kind of what they're doing. They're saying, hey, in these documents, it's 85 total publications, and they can be long. Some of them are weekly readings this week, but they kind of argue for this system of government. They say, hey, we are strengthening our national government, but you, my people, are safe because we know these important traits of a state. So they were written by John Jay. 5 of them were written by John Jay. He got sick. He also had some other responsibilities at the time. So he only contributed 5. Hamilton wrote by far the most. Alexander Hamilton, like it's that play on Broadway, wrote 51 of the Federalist Papers, and James Madison wrote 29 of the said Federalist Papers, having a lot of the structural advocacy in these Federalist Papers. I always say Hamilton wrote and slightly more emotional than Madison, more so calling out the Anti-Federalists, like in a way saying, hey, you idiots, this government's not going to do what you're fearful of. Listen to me. Trust me. He has a really interesting Federalist paper where he talks about the Supreme Court, and he's like, this will be an extremely weak body. You don't have to worry because it can't do anything. And then he later on says how important and powerful the body is. So Hamilton wrote more argumentatively. Madison wrote more beautifully, theoretically. Federalist Paper number 10 is a James Madison work that we'll read next week, which I think is one of the best theoretical works in early American history, in which he calls for the need to address the issue of factions in a pluralist system of government. Some beautiful writing. I'll be reading it next week to you, so you'll be listening to me then. We know that these general papers all had the one overarching purpose of advocating for the ratification of the Constitution as they were written during the Constitutional Convention. And they argued for the coexistence of federalism and republicanism. Remember, at the time, republicanism means you want a system of government with elections. That's all republicanism means. The modern conservative tie-in with republicanism was not present at the time. What we know as Republican is different than what our founding fathers knew as Republican. Same with Democratic and all of those key terms at the time. As I already pointed out, the way they referred to a democracy as a republic. So they argued for republicanism and federalism, national supremacy with power to influence both state and national governments. That's how you can have federalism and republicanism persist. Some of these most notable quotes, although there are many and some beautiful quotes that these don't perfectly represent, include, quote, "Nothing is more certain than the need for government," end quote. End quote. "The people must give to the government some of their natural rights in order to provide it with power," representing the general sentiments of the social contract. If you're interested in political theory, social contract philosophers are very fascinating. And if you take my political theory course, we spend multiple weeks diving into the concept of the social contract alone. Very fascinating. The Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau kind of philosophers. So, Federalist Paper number 1. This is simply just presenting what side of the issue we're on. We're calling for the ratification of the Constitution, and which side of history will you be on? The right side with ratification, or the other? Stating, quote, "Yes, my countrymen, I own to you that after having given it a attentive consideration, I am clearly of opinion it is in your interest to adopt it." Written by Alexander Hamilton, as we see more of an argumentative form of writing, as he's calling for there being a clear right and wrong side of this great question of governance. Due to time, I will not be reading those in detail, but it is one of your readings, and please go through it in detail. It may read as if it's another language, but once you really break it down, it's more accessible than it may seem, and I'm happy to translate any quote if you want to email me about it with any question. Federalist number 51, we see a little bit of the difference in writing here, because we see one written by James Madison. He's not saying, "Hey, open your eyes, dummies. This is the system. This is the right side of the question, right side of the issue." No, he's saying, let's talk about the benefits of checks and balances. Let's talk about how our system will benefit from equal powers distributed among multiple bodies. And this whole work is just advocating for checks and balances. In it, he says, quote, "In the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments," end quote, national and state, "and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments," pause, legislative, executive, judicial, 3 branches of government, continuing, "Hence a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. Checks and balances and the ability for each body to override the rules of each other is essential to the equal distribution of power, which protects the people in a pluralist system of government from that majority overwhelming rule that our founding fathers would have referred to at times as mob rule." So the Anti-Federalist Papers. How do the Anti-Federalist Papers contrast? Well, for one, they go under the pseudonym Brutus. Brutus's story is very similar to that of Publius, except a little bit different. If anybody's interested in the stories of Caesar, when he was revolted against, he was known for saying his last words were "et tu, Brute," and saying "you too, Brutus," as Brutus was a friend of Caesar, yet led the rebellion against his monarchical system of government, as he helped, and as he was the one to stab Brutus, although he was prior a friend of the individual. After he led the people against this tyrannical system of government, he led the passing of a law which say that, actually, we see that I'm looking at notes here, but we see that his primary influence was seen as being heroic in defense of liberty. He would kill his own friend, the absolute controller of the state, in the name of absolute defense of liberty. He chose country over personal loyalty, and Enlightenment thinkers revered to him as a martyr for republican virtues and a warning about the dangers of concentrated power. So we see that here. Brutus represents that we need the brutes. We need Brutus to step up when there is concentration of power. That concentration of power needs and requires martyrs to push back against it. Republicanism is the mechanism in which we can protect ourselves from a tyrannical system of government. And they write, aiming to represent the man with the sword who saved the republic, Brutus. But it's worth noting, when you compare them to the Federalist Papers, they were far less organized, far less purposeful, and Oftentimes, we see many that would fall under the umbrella of the Anti-Federalist Papers writing under pseudonyms that do not align with Brutus. Different pseudonyms. It couldn't even be the same fake person. Their organization was lacking. Some historians argue that Robert Yates, a New York judge, also was the author of the Anti-Federalist Papers, although this is not fully supported with any clear primary documentation, so it is just speculation for the most part. So this includes generally a list of 16 essays, first published in New York, but also if you were a bit more expansive in classification, there would be far more essays than just 16, but of course during the same time period. During the Constitutional Convention, argued that the Constitution would erode state sovereignty, create consolidated national governments, endanger individual liberties, primarily endangering those individual liberties, which resulted in the Bill of Rights, and lead to a standing army and judicial tyranny. So a standing army, which we were also fearful of, because if you have a national army, you're incentivized to use it, as a lot of our founding fathers were fearful of excessive use of military rule. So a lot of those sentiments echoed in the Anti-Federalist Papers, but if you were to summarize it in a single word, a single sentence, it is fear of a central government. They wanted anything other than a unitary system of government. Some of the quotes from the Anti-Federalist Papers that ring most true represents the sentiment are, quote, "The limitation of government is the surest record of the happiness of the people," end quote. End quote. This one I think more notable than the others. Quote, "And after so recent a triumph over the British king, after blood has been spent, it is truly astonishing that a set of men among our Americans would champion a government that would destroy our liberties," end quote. Focusing on any strengthening of our national government would mirror the actions of the government that we viewed as too oppressive, that we had to rebel against. Even focusing on what it means to be American and tying it to the fight for independence. So, why were the Federalists and Anti-Federalists not established political parties? For three main reasons. First, there was no campaigning for the executive branch. One of the most important institutional characteristics of a political party is established campaigning and party-based candidacies. So without campaigning for the executive or any other electoral body via a party system or implemented party lines, we do not have the institutionalization of political parties within the electoral process. Secondly, the executive branch was unaffected by the division. George Washington was apartisan. He did not represent the Federalists or Anti-Federalists, so he was not representing any partisan affiliation. The executive branch was governed among both interests, as we had cabinet members appeasing to the interests of Federalists and Anti-Federalists at the time, as Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who stood at opposite sides of this ideological spectrum, were both working within George Washington's cabinet. So we see the second reason, the executive branch was unaffected by the division. Thank you, old Georgie. And then the third reasoning, multidimensional, but it's overarchingly clear, as the Anti-Federalists lacked structure. They were just an opposition group. It's in the name, Anti-Federalists, anti-constitutionalists at the time. They were unorganized. They could barely write their argumentative papers in the public press, struggling to unify under the single pseudonym of Brutus. They lacked an adequate party platform. What was their party platform? It was national government bad, state rights good, and there was not much of a clear roadway to implementing those policies through other policy avenues. So we see a lack of an adequate party platform, and very simply put, they dissolved identification under this title, Anti-Federalist, after the ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791. They were viewed more or less as a social movement, advocating for state sovereignty, arguing against certain policy initiatives under the under the U.S. Constitution, and then eventually having their needs met through the ratification of the Bill of Rights, resulting in their eventual dissolvement afterwards. So here's that "what do we learn" slide. I've already been talking for over an hour, so I am not going to talk about this slide. Although you can pause it, make sure you can answer these questions to yourself, and then make sure your answers are correct and align with the answers I gave you on this slide right here. So I hope you had a good time listening to me ramble on. I like this lecture today. Constitution Convention is a cool time. It's kind of fun to conceptualize a time period where we were not unified as we like to think, and there was considerable opportunity to represent a system, to present a system that will govern your life and the life of your ancestors, well, life of your children. So, very fascinating time. I love talking about this stuff. And if you have any questions about it, email me. Let's go back and forth. Make sure you understand what's expected of you. What is due this week? Essay topic selection assignment due by the end of this week now. So make sure you do that. It is an even numbered week as well regarding discussions. So that means you have one response that you have to provide. A lot of you have already done this. So you might be good for the week. But when you posted your discussion prompt, your discussion response, your original response, that was like a good hefty paragraph answering my prompt. And then other people were tasked to ask you questions about your original response. You have to respond to just one of your classmates' questions about your original response. Same discussion thread on democracy, so revisit that, give them a response if you haven't done so already. You don't have to respond to every question other classmates ask, just pick one and give it a very purposeful response. That's how you do the discussions. If you email me how to do the discussions, I'll be a little sad because I've explained it in the lectures, but I'm happy to explain it again via email if need be. Essay topic selection assignment. Read the words I have on the slide and the many detailed guidelines I gave you in the documents, which I posted on Eagle Online under this week's module tab and the overarching graded assignments modules tab. Please don't reference the graded assignments modules tab too frequently. Use the week's modules. I just think that's a good thing to provide access to for you guys so you can more easily make sure you're up to date at the end of the semester and you can schedule things out beforehand. So make sure you do all that. Get everything in this week. Here are your readings. Read them. I talked about them a lot today. The Anti-Federalist Papers and the Federalist Papers. They're very valuable readings. And if you don't read them, I'll be sad and you'll be harmed because you won't know what's happening in the world around you. Not in this class, but the world around you. These documents dictated the life we live today and the rights we have today and the avenues in which we can advocate for our own independent thinking or state sovereignty. So give the system of governance that you've inherited from your past generations some respect and read their work. Thank you guys.